I do happen to know that the Queen always used to make sure that she had somebody with her whenever she saw those two, for the reasons that we've been talking about, that they might be taking photographs or, I don't know, recording or anything they might be doing, and she was, very upset by the whole thing. And that's what I really find unforgivable.
Royal historian Hugo Vickers, known for his close connection to Queen Elizabeth, has just dropped a new book, and it's packed with serious revelations about how the Queen truly felt about Prince Harry and Meghan Markle during her final years on the throne. According to Vickers, the situation behind palace doors was far more tense than people realized, and he even made it clear that he personally cannot move past what happened between them and the Queen. Here are 13 things Queen Elizabeth II reportedly felt about Harry and Meghan during those final years, and it paints a very different picture than what many expected. When Harry and Meghan stepped away from royal duties, it reportedly hit the Queen on a deeply personal level. This wasn't just a public shift. It was something that affected her emotionally in a big way. Hugo Vickers claims that after their departure, whenever Prince Harry called, the Queen preferred not to be alone during those conversations. She made sure a trusted lady-in-waiting was always present. This wasn't about refusing to speak with him. It was about being careful. The Queen had reportedly grown cautious and no longer felt fully secure having private conversations without someone else there. There were concerns about how those discussions might later be presented publicly, especially after high-profile interviews and major media moments that had already drawn global attention. Because of that, the Queen wanted everything to be clear and accounted for during those calls. Having someone else in the room ensured there was a shared understanding of what was actually said, reducing the risk of misunderstandings or things being taken out of context later on. Over time, it's said she became increasingly guarded. Private conversations no longer felt completely private, and there was a growing concern that anything discussed could quickly become public headlines the very next day.
Queen has spoken. Just days after Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's explosive interview with Oprah Winfrey aired, Buckingham Palace released a statement on Tuesday in response. Quote, "The whole family is saddened to learn the full extent of how challenging the last few years have been for Harry and Meghan. The issues raised, particularly that of race, are concerning. While some recollections may vary, they are taken very seriously and will be addressed by the family privately."
That shift alone showed just how much the relationship had changed behind the scenes. While many people viewed Harry's royal exit as simply another chapter or a modern transition, for the Queen, it carried much deeper emotional weight. Reports suggest she felt personally let down by someone she cared about deeply, making the situation far more complicated than it appeared from the outside. When the Oprah interview aired, it sent shockwaves across the world, and it reportedly caught the Queen off guard too. According to Hugo Vickers, she was genuinely surprised by several of the claims shared during that moment, especially because of how personal they were. Her now famous response, that some recollections may vary, was widely seen as a calm but firm way of pushing back without turning it into a public clash. Even in that tense moment, the Queen chose restraint over reaction. She still cared deeply about Harry and had no intention of damaging his image while she was still serving as monarch. Instead of responding, emotionally, she leaned into dignity, keeping everything measured and controlled, even though, behind the scenes, it clearly affected her. Vickers also points out that the Queen believed Harry had a strong and meaningful role within the royal family. She saw him as someone who truly connected with people in a natural way, and that made him a key part of what the future of the monarchy could look like. His work, especially with veterans, stood out in a major way.
I wonder, it's so difficult to work out what's really going on in his head, but as far as I can see, he wasn't that unhappy until his wife came along and told him he was unhappy. That's my reading of it, but that may be unfair.
The creation of the Invictus Games, a global sporting event for wounded servicemen and women, made her extremely proud. She didn't just support it quietly, she even appeared in promotional content, showing just how much she respected what Harry had built. That's why his decision to step away reportedly left her confused. From her perspective, he was thriving in his role, gaining respect, and making a real impact. So the question lingered, why walk away at that point, when everything seemed to be working in his favor? There were also claims that when Harry first brought up marrying Meghan Markle, the Queen advised him to slow things down. She reportedly suggested waiting at least another year before making such a big decision, wanting more time to understand Meghan and the situation better. But Harry chose to follow his heart and move forward sooner than she had hoped, setting the stage for everything that followed. According to the book, this moment didn't make the Queen openly opposed, but it definitely made her more cautious. She wasn't rushing to block anything, but there was a clear sense of hesitation building behind the scenes. When Harry decided to move forward with the wedding despite her advice, her reaction was described as emotionally distant. Vickers claims she simply responded in a short and controlled way, making it clear that the decision was now entirely his to carry forward. Instead of stepping in or creating tension, she pulled back and allowed him to make his own choices, attending the wedding more out of duty as monarch and grandmother than as someone actively involved in the process. One of the more talked about claims in the book is that the Queen was not fully impressed with Meghan Markle's wedding dress. According to Vickers, she reportedly felt the look didn't completely align with traditional expectations, especially considering royal customs. Even small design details, including the cut and structure.
Remember when you told us to bring it at the Invictus Games?
Careful what you wish for.
Oh, really? Please.
Were said to raise quiet concerns about etiquette. Still, despite any personal opinions, the Queen showed up with full composure and grace. She didn't allow any of those feelings to turn into public drama, keeping everything calm and controlled in front of the world. Another moment that stands out involves reports about how staff were treated inside the palace. According to the book, the Queen personally stepped in after hearing concerns about interactions with royal employees, including a situation involving a gardener at Windsor. Vickers claims she addressed it directly, reinforcing how important respect and professionalism were within the royal household. For the Queen, how staff were treated was a direct reflection of character. This wasn't something small to her, it was a core value that she took seriously throughout her entire reign. Duty, above everything, defined Queen Elizabeth's life. From the moment she became heir, she viewed royal responsibility as something permanent, not optional. It wasn't a role you stepped away from when things got difficult, it was a lifelong commitment. That's why the decision by Harry and Meghan to step back reportedly left her struggling to fully understand it. From her perspective, challenges were something you carried while continuing your responsibilities, not a reason to walk away from them. She had lived through global conflict, political pressure, and deeply personal hardships, all while maintaining her role without pause. Seeing members of her own family choose a different path felt completely unfamiliar within that mindset of service. Despite everything, the Queen didn't respond with public anger or dramatic statements. Vickers claims her reaction was much quieter, marked by sadness rather than confrontation. She kept her disappointment private, maintaining the same calm and composed image she had shown for decades, even while dealing with personal emotions behind closed doors.
Well, I do remember what the Queen said at one point was, I'm not sure she used these exact words, but basically, sort of one minute he's Captain General of the Royal Marines and the next minute he's just a childminder. I think she felt that, that he deserted the ship. He could have done much more. He also was doing a very good job.
She chose silence and dignity over public reaction. That decision reflected her long-standing belief in stability, especially during uncertain times. And this was all happening during a very challenging period for the monarchy. There was already pressure building from multiple directions, including public scrutiny and internal changes within the royal family. According to the book, the Queen was concerned that ongoing interviews and public discussions could place even more strain on the institution she had spent her life protecting. The demand for immediate responses only added to that pressure, especially for someone who preferred careful and measured communication. Vickers also claims that concerns about Harry didn't suddenly appear during the royal exit. They had been building earlier. Those close to the Queen reportedly saw him as someone deeply emotional and sometimes influenced by others around him. Within that perspective, there were growing conversations about who was guiding the direction of decisions being made. It created a sense of concern about how everything was unfolding and where it might lead next. The Queen reportedly summed up her concern in a very direct way, describing Harry as deeply attached and emotionally driven. Coming from someone known for carefully choosing every word, that kind of description stood out in a major way. And underneath all of that wasn't just disappointment, it was worry. Real concern about whether he had moved too fast into major life decisions without fully seeing the long-term impact on himself, his family, and the institution he was born into. As everything continued to unfold, the distance between Harry and the rest of the royal family reportedly became more noticeable than ever. What once looked like a temporary shift started to feel more permanent, and that change did not go unnoticed by the Queen.
She saw a different side to her, and very disappointingly, she started to have her doubts about her, and I think it ruined her relationship with Harry, which was very...
According to accounts surrounding this period, communication between Harry and the palace became more limited and far more controlled. It wasn't the same open and relaxed dynamic that had existed before. Every interaction now carried a sense of caution, with careful wording and awareness of how things might later be interpreted publicly. For the Queen, this shift was deeply uncomfortable. She had always valued privacy within the family, believing that personal matters should stay behind palace walls. Seeing private conversations and internal discussions become topics of global headlines reportedly went against everything she stood for. There was also a growing concern about how quickly situations were escalating. What used to be handled quietly within the institution was now playing out in real time across media platforms, creating pressure that even the monarchy struggled to contain. The Queen, known for her steady and measured approach, found herself in a situation where patience was being tested like never before. At the same time, the monarchy itself was entering a new era. With generational changes already underway, every decision carried more weight than usual. The Queen understood that stability was everything, especially during moments of transition, and anything that threatened that balance was taken seriously. Reports suggest she became increasingly focused on protecting the long-term future of the institution. This meant making difficult choices, maintaining boundaries, and ensuring that the monarchy remained steady despite the noise surrounding it. And while she remained publicly neutral, behind closed doors there was a clear awareness that the situation involving Harry and Meghan was no longer just a family matter. It had become a global narrative that people were watching closely. That level of attention added pressure to every move, every statement, every appearance. Every decision had to be carefully considered. The Queen was not just dealing with personal emotions.
Problem, Angela, with white, first of all. Why was white too white?
Well, I think it's sort of vaginal, isn't it? You're very pure and you haven't had lots of affairs or been married before or anything like that. And I think it's for the first marriage that you have as well. And I think she didn't like it that Meghan was dressing up as if she was, very virginal. She didn't like that because she knew it wasn't true. She'd been married.
She was managing the expectations of an entire country and beyond. There were also moments where it reportedly became clear that rebuilding trust would not be simple. Once that sense of confidence in private conversations was shaken, it created a gap that could not easily be repaired overnight. The Queen understood this, and it influenced how she approached every interaction moving forward. Even so, she never allowed that tension to turn into public conflict. Her approach remained consistent: stay composed, stay neutral, and avoid escalating the situation. That level of discipline defined how she handled even the most challenging moments during her reign. At the same time, the contrast between past and present became impossible to ignore. Harry had once been seen as one of the most relatable and widely supported members of the royal family. His connection with the public, his energy, and his work had all positioned him as a key figure in the monarchy's future. That's why the shift felt so significant. It wasn't just about stepping away, it was about the sudden change in direction that left many, including the Queen, trying to understand what had really happened behind the scenes. There were also concerns about how the situation might influence public perception moving forward. The monarchy had always relied on a sense of unity and continuity, and visible divisions risked creating uncertainty at a time when stability was essential. The Queen reportedly remained focused on keeping that sense of continuity intact. Even as headlines continued to circulate and speculation grew,
And said, Meghan, in this family, we don't speak to people like that. And that was a sign of the tensions. Meghan was an actress. She's probably used to speaking to staff in quite an abrupt way. But in the royal family, servants, they're almost part of the family. In some cases, like Queen's right-hand woman, Angela Kelly, they're almost like a sister or a daughter to Her Majesty. Even Meghan's bridal gown was apparently the cause of...
She stayed committed to presenting a steady and unified image to the world, and that wasn't easy. Balancing personal feelings with public responsibility required constant control, especially when emotions were involved. But that was something she had mastered over decades of leadership. Through all of this, one thing remained clear: She was not reacting impulsively. Every move was deliberate, every response carefully considered. That approach allowed her to navigate a situation that could have easily spiraled into something much bigger. At the same time, there was an understanding that time would play a role in how everything settled. Situations like this don't resolve overnight, and the Queen appeared to recognize that patience would be key in allowing things to unfold naturally. Still, the uncertainty remained. Questions about the future, about relationships, and about how everything would eventually be remembered continued to linger in the background. And as those questions stayed unanswered, the story continued to evolve in real time. People were watching closely, trying to piece together what was really happening beyond the headlines. But for the Queen, the focus never shifted away from what mattered most: protecting the institution, maintaining stability, and handling every challenge with the same level of composure that had defined her entire reign. Even as the situation remained complex and emotionally charged, she stayed consistent in her approach, showing once again why she was seen as a symbol of steadiness during times of uncertainty. Because in the end,
said to a friend of hers, now he's simply a childminder, whereas he had a lot of very important responsibilities beforehand. And what the Queen and what Prince William and what the King now are all doing, they're putting things into life, they're serving, which is complete opposite of what Prince Harry.
While narratives may change and opinions may shift, the way she handled these moments became part of the legacy she left behind. One built on restraint, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to duty, no matter how difficult the circumstances became. Despite all the disappointment, confusion, and growing pressure surrounding the situation, one thing reportedly never changed: the Queen's affection for Harry. According to Hugo Vickers, no matter how complicated things became, she always saw him first as her grandson before anything else. That personal bond didn't just fade away because of disagreements or public tension. Even during moments where she strongly disagreed with the direction he was taking, that underlying connection remained. It wasn't about cutting him off or turning her back. It was about trying to understand a situation that didn't align with everything she had spent her life standing for. And that internal conflict made everything feel even heavier behind palace walls. What made the situation even more emotional was the fact that this wasn't a distant relationship. It was deeply personal. This wasn't just any member of the family making a controversial decision. This was someone she had watched grow up, someone she had supported through different stages of life, and someone she believed had a meaningful role within the royal family's future. So when things began to shift, it didn't just create headlines, it created real emotional weight. The distance that formed wasn't just physical or professional, it was something that carried emotional consequences as well. And according to Vickers, that's exactly why it was so difficult for her to fully come to terms with everything. At the same time, even while processing those feelings, the Queen never allowed emotion to override her sense of responsibility. That's something that defined her entire life.
Sure, he has many regrets, and I do feel sorry for him, just on a human level. He obviously got on terribly well with his grandmother. They looked as though they were getting on terribly.
She had always been able to separate personal challenges from public duty, and this situation was no different. Even though it may have been one of the more difficult moments she faced, Vickers emphasizes that she remained steady in how she approached everything. She didn't lash out, she didn't escalate, and she didn't turn the situation into a public battle. Instead, she handled it quietly, keeping her thoughts controlled and her actions measured, just as she had done throughout decades of leadership. And that approach wasn't accidental. It was intentional. The Queen understood that every reaction she gave would carry weight, not just within the family, but across the entire world. One strong statement, one emotional response, could have shifted the entire narrative instantly. That's why she stayed consistent, calm, composed, and focused on the bigger picture. Even when things were tense behind the scenes, she maintained a steady presence in public, reinforcing the image of stability that had defined her reign for so long. According to Vickers, the Queen also never lost confidence in how her legacy would be remembered. She had lived through global challenges, political changes, and countless moments of uncertainty. One family situation, even one as widely discussed as this, was not going to define everything she had built over decades. She believed that history would reflect her dedication, her discipline, and her commitment to service above all else. And that belief allowed her to stay grounded, even when the situation around her continued to evolve in unpredictable ways. Her focus remained firmly on continuity. Making sure the monarchy stayed strong, stable, and prepared for the future was always at the center of her decisions. No matter what was happening on the personal side, the institution itself had to remain steady, and that required control. It required patience. It required a level of discipline that very few people could maintain.
Logically, obviously, it worked, but secondly, they both caused the Queen a lot of anguish in the last years of her life. It was one thing I will never forgive the Sussexes for, is the amount of stress they caused.
Under that kind of pressure. But for the Queen, that level of control had become second nature over the course of her reign. At the same time, it's important to understand just how layered the situation really was. On one side, there was family, real emotions, real relationships, real memories. On the other side, there was duty, an institution that represented tradition, stability, and continuity for an entire nation. Balancing those two worlds was never simple. And in moments like this, that balance became even more challenging. Every decision carried emotional weight, but also institutional consequences. Every step forward had to be carefully considered from both perspectives. Vickers suggests that this is exactly why the Queen chose the path she did. Rather than allowing the situation to spiral publicly, she contained it. Rather than reacting emotionally, she responded with restraint. That decision helped prevent the situation from escalating even further. But that doesn't mean it was easy. Behind that calm exterior, there were still real feelings involved. There was still disappointment, still confusion, still a sense of loss over how things had changed. And yet, none of that was allowed to disrupt the bigger mission. That's what made her approach so unique. She could carry personal emotion while still presenting complete stability to the world. As time went on, the situation continued to develop, but her approach stayed the same. Consistent, controlled, and focused. She didn't chase headlines, she didn't respond to every claim, and she didn't allow herself to be pulled into ongoing public debates. Instead, she remained anchored in her role, showing once again why she had been able to lead through so many different eras without losing that sense of balance. And while public opinion continued to shift and conversations around Harry and Meghan remained active, the Queen's position stayed clear.
That pained her deeply. And, don't forget that she loved Harry. Yeah. She loved Harry, and she would speak to Elizabeth and recall, the Queen would speak to her cousin Elizabeth and recall the conversations that she was having with them while they were first in Canada and then in LA. And of course she's watching her grandchildren grow up hundreds of miles away from her, and I think that upset her too. And I think on a human level, she
wasn't engaging in public disputes. She wasn't adding fuel to the conversation. She was staying above it. That level of restraint became part of how the situation was ultimately perceived. While others spoke openly and shared their perspectives, the Queen's silence spoke in a different way, one that reflected control, discipline, and long-term thinking. At the same time, the emotional side of the story never fully disappeared. Reports continued to suggest that, despite everything, her care for Harry remained present. That connection didn't vanish. It simply existed alongside the reality of the situation, and that's what makes this entire chapter so complex. It wasn't just conflict. It wasn't just disagreement. It was a mix of loyalty, responsibility, emotion, and legacy, all happening at the same time. Vickers highlights that the Queen understood something many people overlook. Moments like this are temporary, but legacy is long-term. The headlines may focus on conflict in the moment, but history looks at the full picture over time. And in her mind, that full picture was already clear. Decades of service, decades of consistency, decades of leadership. That was what would ultimately define how she was remembered. That belief gave her confidence. It allowed her to move through difficult moments without feeling the need to react instantly or dramatically. She trusted that time would provide clarity, and that mindset shaped how everything unfolded. While the situation remained active in the public eye, she stayed focused on her responsibilities.
It was, I have no question saying, one of the greatest reigns in British history, the greatest reign to have lived in under any political or economic circumstances. And nobody could ever, if we lived for 1,000 years, do what she did. Make a promise, 1947, to serve all.
Ensuring that nothing disrupted the continuity of the monarchy. Even in the face of uncertainty, she remained steady. Even in moments of emotional weight, she stayed composed. And even as the narrative continued to evolve, she never lost control of her role. That consistency became one of the defining features of how this entire situation was handled. It showed that, no matter how complicated things became behind the scenes, the public image of stability would always remain intact. In the end, this wasn't just a story about disagreement, it was a story about how someone at the highest level of responsibility manages personal emotion while protecting something much bigger than themselves. And through it all, the Queen stayed true to who she had always been, focused, disciplined, and committed to the role she had carried for so many years. So when you look at everything together, the emotional side, the institutional pressure, the public attention, it becomes clear that this was never a simple situation. It was layered, complex, and constantly evolving. But one thing remained consistent from beginning to end: her approach, calm, controlled, and always centered on the bigger picture. There you have it, 13 major claims from Hugo Vickers' book, revealing how Queen Elizabeth truly felt about Harry and Meghan's royal exit and everything that came with it. Now it's your turn. How do you think Harry's decision impacted the Queen during those final years? Did it change how you see the situation, or does it confirm what you already believed? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you in the next one.